Okay guys, in today's A-level PE revision video, we're going to be focusing on the social principles of physical education, which is paper 2, and in particular we're going to be focusing on the globalisation of sport and the impact it had on British sport. So one of the first areas you want to basically be sure about is how sport has been spread, not only across the world, but across Britain at the end of or throughout the Industrial Revolution and the rationalisation process. And an easy way to remember this is an acronym, CACTI-CUP. And the A stands for the Army. So the sport was taken by officers leaving the private schools, the students leaving private schools, joining the army and becoming officers, and then teaching the sport to their subordinates and the other soldiers. Colonial is where the sport was taken across the British Empire, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. Administration is where the public school boys had left and became members of national governing bodies. The church is that some of the boys took up roles in the clergy and then taught the sports to their to the worshippers at the church. Teaching, as some of them took up roles as teachers and then taught the sports that they'd developed in the schools they went to work at. Industry is where they became factory owners or worked for their fathers who had factories and then brought the sports to their factory teams. Clubs, there was essentially an old network of old boy clubs, old public school boy clubs. Many of the boys went to university and took their sports, or became employees of the university and took their sports there. And patronage is where we're essentially talking about the sponsorship and providing the broken time payments to the working class, the playing professionals. So one of the first things we need to look at is that sport has spread across the British Empire, and we need to remember that the UK was the first modern society due to the Industrial Revolution. So they developed these sports, and we're the first country to rationalize sports and write down the rules, which is codification. And then these rules and sports were sent abroad via many means to the British Empire and the British colonies. So they refer to it as sport following the flag, the British Union Jack. And the sports essentially developed at that point. It was around the same time as the British Empire was developing and the colonies were developing. So they were both going hand in hand and developing together, which made sense that sport followed the flag and the colonies. So the UK citizens took these sports to many other countries and setting up the clubs that they could play in. And essentially the other nationalities wanted to copy these sports and emulate the British. And then the British were encouraging locals to play their sports, giving them opportunities for more games and competition. Now, many of the British colonies had missionaries and religion, and it was aimed as a way of civilizing cultures and using sport as a method for maybe controlling the locals as the British invaded and took over the world. Now, obviously, the army played a massive impact on the spread of sport globally, and many of the military officers came from public schools where they developed the sports, and then the sports were taught to the soldiers and in turn the locals of the countries that we were settling in. And then finally, trade links also were a means to set up and transport these sports and the rules, and industrial teams were set up under basic UK influence. So you need to be really clear on the basic history of the British Empire and essentially the impact it had on how sport followed the British Empire. So public schools and universities were taken into the new colonies, and many of the boys leaving those public schools and universities joined the empire. So education was really important in the spread of sport, and this also was impacted in the education system was adopted by many of the countries such as New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, where they adopted the types of Thomas Arnold-esque approaches to the education system, and using sport as a vehicle for improving social control and muscular Christianity and athleticism. The industrial expansion with the railways, factories, all of those were then utilised as to create teams, and then the opportunity to play and develop leagues across the UK and then eventually across the world. The church and Christianity spread across the British Empire and UK, and they took the sport with them. We've talked about the army many a times now, so I'm not going to go over that. But the introduction of the civil service, which is around about the Industrial Revolution, which is aimed at improving living standards for individuals and the public, that was a key factor for the need for developing sport and health and fitness. So sometimes in these type of questions, you might be asked about how your knowledge and understanding from across the course of study impacts the spread of sport. So you need to include elements from social aspects, psychological and skill acquisition, and anatomy and physiology. So the social one tends to be the easier one, where, like, for example, national governing bodies were formed and then created and led to the development of international governing bodies. The sports like rugby and cricket, with the more popular sports, football, rugby and cricket, are the more popular sports that spread nationally and internationally. We talked about the adoption of the education system and the army needing to be fit. But then also we have the idea of the Commonwealth Games was set up. It was initially called the British Empire Games, but it got changed to the Commonwealth Games. But the idea of setting up a competition for those countries just in the British Empire. We've got the idea of the CACTI-CUP, which I talked about earlier, the spread of sport, and the reference to colonial cousins. So when we invaded these countries and took over these countries, we call them our colonial cousins, and the fact that Christianity spread. And it also helped develop, these sports developed a colonial identity. Now, you always got to talk about some sort of aspects that counter the spread of sport. And for example, football was only really adopted in Europe and South America. Other countries like Australasia, they didn't adopt football, whereas it's very much adopted in other countries that aren't part of the British Empire. The colonization wasn't always seen as positive, so that made a resentment and a cultural kickback. Many countries sort of developed their own games, USA in particular, developing baseball and American football, Australia developing Aussie rules football. So other ways that you might link in anatomy and physiology includes, very loosely really, the idea of improving awareness of the benefits of exercise to the colonial countries, and obviously across the UK, improved preparation and methods for the matches that were taking place. We've got elements of identification of muscle fiber types, and for example, the stereotypical athletes that may be linked through muscle fiber types and genetics, you could link into that. And then just having a knowledge of body systems and improving health and fitness, which could also be taught to the savages that we of the colonies that we took over. In terms of skill acquisition, it's always good to try and get in attitudes in some way. If you ever get skill acquisition, you need to link it in. The attitudes evolved from the empire. We got the idea of the USA win at all costs evolved from as a kickback from the British Empire. Aggression was, for example, adopted through cultures who adopted rugby, as an aggression type of sport, that they could vent their aggressions. We encouraged those, so to avoid the conflict that could happen. And introducing these sports had an element of cohesion to the national, the nation. And then we developed British tactics that were spread across the world, and these styles of play were adopted in a colonial manner. So there you have it, a whistle-stop tour of the impact of the British colonies and spread of sport. It is a typically difficult question, so do revise this area, and good luck.